as we mentioned yesterday, Truman's administration was called the Fair Deal, and the name of the Eisenhower administration is going to be modern republicanism. So I'm going to tell you some important legislation that was passed by Congress during the Eisenhower presidency, and see if they ring similar to the Fair Deal a little bit, although they're opposite parties. So I'm going to give you 5 important pieces of legislation that were passed by Congress during the Eisenhower presidency. Okay, number 1. See if this rings a bell. Congress increased Social Security benefits to aid an additional 10.5 million people. Does it sound familiar? Okay, who else did that? And was it the same number?
Yeah.
Additional 10.5? 10 million. 10. So, in other words, since the Fair Deal and modern republicanism came into being, Social Security benefits raised to include an additional 20.5 million people. 10 million during the Fair Deal, 10.5 during modern republicanism. Okay, the minimum wage was also addressed. What is the minimum wage now according to the Fair Deal? 75 cents an hour. It raised during Eisenhower's first term from 75 cents an hour to $1 an hour. So he made another 25-cent increase. Okay, so the minimum wage from 75 to $1 per hour. Another thing that happened, another piece of legislation during modern republicanism, was Congress authorized federal funding for both medical research and the construction of new hospitals. So during the first term of President Eisenhower, Congress authorized federal funding for medical research and the construction of new hospitals. Fourth piece of legislation was when Congress spent approximately $500 million to clear slums across the United States. Fourth piece of legislation is where Congress spent nearly $500 million for the clearance of slums across the nation. That was a big concern during the Truman, when he ran for president in 1948. And Eisenhower is one that really spent the money to do that, $500 million to clear slums. And this was kind of interesting, and you'll find out why later. The final piece of legislation that was passed during the first term of Dwight Eisenhower was Congress provided governmental student loans for those students that were interested in the study of science at colleges and universities across the country. So they gave special student loans, obviously at a low interest rate, for those students that were interested to go into college to study science. And you'll find out a little bit more why they did that later on. So, 5 pieces of legislation during modern republicanism during Eisenhower's first term. Congress increased Social Security benefits to aid an additional 10.5 million people. Congress raised the minimum wage from 75 cents an hour to $1 an hour. Congress authorized federal funding for medical research and the construction of new hospitals. Congress spent approximately $500 million for the clearance of slums across the United States. And they also provided governmental low-interest loans to students who would go to college and study science. Okay, some of the things that were done during the first term of Dwight Eisenhower. Okay, that'll take us to our next subtopic, and I don't think we've had one of these yet. 1953 at a glance. I'm going to tell you kind of an interesting thing that happened in each month of 1953. Now, before I do that, I went over to Tensleep yesterday and met with Madison Bolts, because she's taken this class. Hi, Madison, how's it going? She's taken this class by virtue of the videos, and so I went over to meet with her. And I was waiting to talk to the principal, and I was thinking I had 1952 in my mind, and I went to the trophy case, and I want you to know that the Tensleep Pioneers won the boys basketball state championship in Class C in Wyoming in 1952. So I thought that was kind of impressive. Okay, 1953 at a glance. We'll talk about January. We're going to try to tell you 2 things that happened in each month, okay, of the year 1953. On January 1st of 1953, Hank Williams, who was a very famous country western singer, died at the age of 29 while traveling through West Virginia. Hank Williams, very famous country music singer of the time, died at a very young age of 29 while he was traveling through West Virginia. Now, most of you have probably heard of Hank Williams Jr., who is his son. But Hank Williams was a very popular country western singer, and he died tragically at the age of 29 while traveling through West Virginia. What he did, he was on his way to a show in Canton, Ohio, and he went to sleep in the back of his Cadillac, just stopped to sleep, and died in his sleep, and nobody really understood why. Never been really diagnosed. So he was on his way to a show in Canton, Ohio. He was driving through West Virginia, decided to pull over and go to sleep, found him dead in his Cadillac limousine the next morning. Second thing that happened in January happened on the 2nd, and that's when Mr. Republican, Senator Robert Taft of Ohio, was elected Senate Majority Leader, which is a big, big position, maybe more powerful actually than the Vice President. So Senator Robert Taft of Ohio, Mr. Republican, was elected Senate Majority Leader. You know who held that post longer than any man in American history? Mike Mansfield from Montana. Okay, we'll talk about him later. February 1953. February 17th, President Eisenhower rejected an appeal. He rejected an appeal. And it was for clemency. What's an appeal for clemency? You appeal for clemency. It means you did something wrong and you're appealing to the President of the United States to see if he will grant you clemency or let you go. Well, the appeal was sent by Ethel and Julius Rosenberg. And when that appeal by Ethel and Julius Rosenberg was sent to President Eisenhower, he rejected that. He rejected their appeal for clemency. Anybody know what those two did?
Spies.
They were spies. Yeah, in 1951, they were convicted of selling top secret materials to the Soviet Union, and they were sentenced in 1951 to die in the electric chair for their crime. And so they appealed to the president for clemency, for leniency, for whatever you want to call it, and he rejected their appeal. Okay, they were given the death sentence, the electric chair for selling top secret materials to the Soviet Union. And that happened in 1951. This is 1953, so they're on death row, correct? And they appealed to the president for clemency, and he denied that. Okay, in March, two things happened in March of significance. First one on March 5th. And on March 5th of 1953, Joseph Stalin, the most powerful leader in the history of the Soviet Union, died of a major stroke in Moscow. So on March 5th of 1953, Joseph Stalin, the most powerful leader in the history of the Soviet Union, died of a major stroke in Moscow. Okay, the next thing of significance occurred on March 26th. Anybody know who Dr. Jonas Salk is? Anybody in here know who that man is? He invented something pretty important. Vaccine for polio. Very good. And what he did on March 26th wasn't invent that so much. He was working through the University of Pittsburgh, and he reported a vaccine against polio had been successfully tested in 90 adults and children. So he was working on the polio vaccine, and he reported on March 26th of 1953 that a vaccine that he helped create against polio had been successfully tested in 90 adults and children. So what were they working on? A cure for polio. It eventually happens. So Dr. Jonas Salk is best known for his work in the cure for polio. Okay, April 1953. This is be of significance. You know this person. On April 8th of 1953, the bones of Sioux Chief Sitting Bull were moved from North Dakota to South Dakota after setting in North Dakota for 63 years. So the bones of Sioux Chief Sitting Bull were moved from his burial spot in North Dakota to a burial spot in South Dakota after 63 years. Bones of Sioux Chief Sitting Bull are removed from North Dakota to South Dakota after 63 years. That's what happened on April 8th. On April 20th, the first prisoner of war exchange as a result of the Korean War began. Okay, we exchanged prisoners of war, and 30 American soldiers were freed that were captured during the Korean War. And what it was, the significance of April 20th, it was the first POW exchange as a result of the Korean War, where we exchanged prisoners of war with each other, so to speak, and it resulted in 30 American soldiers being set free that had previously been prisoners of war as a result of the Korean War. Okay? May 4th, a fellow by the name of Ernest Hemingway won the Pulitzer Prize for Literature. You ever heard of Ernest Hemingway? Well, maybe that was the novel that he won it for. Very good, Buck. Man, you miss a day of school, you just don't miss anything, right? So, on May 4th of 1953, Ernest Hemingway was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Literature for his novel that was entitled The Old Man and the Sea. Anybody read that? Okay. Well, anyway, that was a Pulitzer Prize winning novel, and he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize on May 4th, 1953. Kind of an interesting thing happened on May 18th. A gal by the name of Jacqueline Cochran became the first woman to fly faster than the speed of sound. Okay, she was one of America's leading flyers at the time, which was unusual at the time because she was female. And Jacqueline Cochran on May 18th of 1953 became the first woman ever to fly faster than the speed of sound. She traveled over 760 miles per hour and breaking the sound barrier, and became the first woman pilot ever to do so on May 18th, 1953.
She was the first ever, or just the first woman?
First woman to break the speed barrier, but not the first person. Okay, June of 1953. It's kind of interesting. The Supreme Court barred Washington, D.C. restaurants from refusing service to Negroes. First time in our country's history, the nation's capital, on June 2nd of 1953, the Supreme Court ruled that Washington, D.C. restaurants could no longer refuse service to Negroes. Did that mean that every restaurant in the country couldn't do it? No, it only meant that those in Washington, D.C. could not do it. So again, on June 2nd, 1953, the Supreme Court ruled that all restaurants in the nation's capital of Washington, D.C. could not refuse service to Negroes. Kind of funny they didn't make that ruling nationwide, but they certainly did not. What happened on June 19th that had to do with February 17th? Anybody want to guess what happened on June 19th that had to do with February 17th? The Rosenbergs were executed by electrical shock for their conviction of espionage. So they were executed on that date. Ethel and Julius Rosenberg were executed by electrical shock for their conviction of espionage against the United States of America. Great, moving on to July. Great year, isn't it? July 1st. The United States of America on July 1st, 1953, had accumulated the largest peacetime deficit in American history. We had accumulated the largest peacetime deficit. Now, they figure deficits two ways. You're going to have a larger deficit, are you not, during war? Okay, this is peacetime. Are we in peacetime now? Yes. What's our deficit? Anybody know? 20 trillion? Well, this was the largest peacetime deficit in American history on July 1st, 1953, $9.4 billion. $9.4 billion. It was the largest peacetime deficit in American history on July 1st, 1953 at $9.4 billion. Well, on the 15th, we had a pretty famous musical comedy film that came out. It was called Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. And who did it star? Marilyn Monroe. We'll talk a lot about her in the future. So, on July 15th of 1953, a musical comedy film entitled Gentlemen Prefer Blondes debuted, starring Marilyn Monroe. And that was July of 1953. Large deficit and a new musical comedy featuring Marilyn Monroe. August 8th, 1953. Any tracksters in here that throw, you don't throw the javelin in Wyoming, do you? They outlawed that. They still throw it in Montana. Matter of fact, my son is the state record holder in Montana in Class C javelin, the state. But anyway, on August 8th, this might not interest you as much as I thought it might. On August 8th, an American athlete by the name of Franklin Buddy Held set a world javelin record with the throw of 263 feet, 10 inches. So on August 8th, 1953, American athlete Franklin Buddy Held set a world javelin record with the throw of 263 feet, 10 inches. 263.10, that's quite a throw. If you divide that by 3, how many yards is that? Almost, 80 yards probably. Pretty good throw. No more than 80 yards, 85, 90. 90 times 3 is 270. So about 85 yards he threw the javelin. Now, he broke his own record in 1955. He threw 268.2, if you care. And then his best throw ever came in 1956, where he threw 270 feet even. So that's a long throw, when you think about it. So 9 times 3 is 27. So he did throw a javelin 90 yards. That's quite a ways. Quite a throw. And 1956, the last one. So he was quite the javelin thrower, very successful Olympian. Now, here's what happened on August 14th, and more people probably cared about this. The Soviet Union announced to the world that they had built and successfully tried a hydrogen bomb, which was small enough to use in warfare. Okay? Now, what's the difference between the hydrogen bomb we dropped and this one is that the only way you could use ours in warfare was to just drop it on a country and blow the heck out of it, right? This one could be used in warfare. In other words, not such mass destruction you could use in different battles to win the battle. Does that make sense? And so it was even more concerning to the United States because we did not have a hydrogen bomb that could work in warfare, in single warfare, just the one that would do devastation. So the Soviet Union's announcing that they also now have a hydrogen bomb, and ours is better than yours because we can use ours in warfare and you cannot. Okay, September 12th, the wedding of the decade. My goodness, ladies, the wedding of the decade on September 12th occurred in Newport, Rhode Island. The wedding of the decade occurred. We won't ask you who you voted for.
Okay.
The wedding of the decade occurred in Newport, Rhode Island. Who got married? Senator John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts and Jacqueline Bouvier were married in what was deemed by the press and all the glamour coverage as the wedding of the decade. A very rich Senator John F. Kennedy and a very wealthy Jacqueline Bouvier marry in Newport, Rhode Island, known in the media history as the wedding of the decade. That's what happened on the 12th. Probably got more attention than what happened on the 30th. Pretty simple, but it'll make sense to you. President Eisenhower appointed Governor Earl Warren of California, who ran in which election? As vice president in 1948. He appoints Governor Earl Warren of California as the 14th Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. So, again, big appointment on September 30th, 1953, President Eisenhower appointed Governor Earl Warren of California as the 14th Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And he served for many, many years. You'll find out later that he will be the Chief Justice when Kennedy's assassination is investigated on orders of President Lyndon Johnson, which becomes known in history as the Warren Commission. Okay? So it was on September 30th of 1953 that Earl Warren became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. All right, October 5th. This will kind of tie up with kind of where we're at now. took 108 years for the Chicago Cubs to win one world championship, right? Well, on October 5th of 1953, the New York Yankees won their 5th straight World Series championship. The 5th straight. On October 5th, the New York Yankees of Major League Baseball won their 5th consecutive World Series championship. And their manager, Casey Stengel, became the first manager in Major League Baseball history to coach 5 World Championship teams. Did he coach all 5 in a row? No, but he coached 5 World Championship teams. I don't know if there's a manager today that's coached 5. You know, you're kind of a baseball guy. Anybody manager had 5 World Championship teams? I know that Bruce Bochy has 3. I'm not sure we ever had another manager that's got 5. Okay, that's a lot of championships. So on October 5th of 1953, the New York Yankees win their 5th consecutive World Series championship, and their manager, Casey Stengel, becomes the first manager in Major League Baseball history to coach 5 World Championship teams. How about the 31st of October? Guess what came in just a few homes and mainly around New York City?
Microwave.
No, you're close though. Which kind? Color. Very good. The first experimental color televisions. They put in a few homes in and around New York City, and they let some of those selected people be treated to experimental color television. And by Christmas, color television sets are going to flood the shops all across the eastern coast. People are going to really get into color TVs. If they could afford one. Yeah, there you go. So on October 31st of 1953, television sets in a few homes in and around New York City were a treat to special experimental color televisions. And they said by Christmas, the shops would be flooded with the new color TV.